Okay, and now we have another example. I think we've been trying to have very different examples each time. So this is going to look different from the last two as well.
Cool. Hi, everybody. My name is Sam, and I'm going to talk about a new paper that takes sort of a wacky approach to using citizen science on the internet, archival data, data science, and a whole bunch of different things. By way of introduction, if any of you know me, I know a few people here only, I'm a fan of science Twitter, and this tweet was going around the internet a little while ago. The hardest things to explain to aliens if their species don't have it: sex, religion, war, comedy, why we constantly sabotage our own happiness because we're afraid of failure, etc. And music. And I love this tweet because I think this is sort of a laundry list of things that people in psychology are studying. I studied that one towards the top. Music is kind of a puzzle in human psychology. We don't really know what it's for. We don't really know why we have it. There's a few ideas out there. Ed Hagen and Greg Bryant proposed a theory of music as signaling the cooperative ability in groups. With Max Krasnow in grad school, we had a theory of why parents sing to their infants. Manveer Singh has a theory of why shamanistic behavior turns up worldwide in conjunction with ritual and musical behaviors. Jeffrey Miller thinks music is all about sex. Anyway, there's a lot of ideas out there, and we don't really know much about which of them, if any, are right. But one of the things that they all have in common is a prediction that Henry Wadsworth Longfellow came up with before there was much modern science, about 200 years ago. He wrote, "The muleteer of Spain carols with the early lark amid the stormy mountains of his native land. The vintager of Sicily has his evening hymn, the fisherman of Naples his boat song, the gondolier of Venice his midnight serenade. Music is the universal language of mankind, poetry their universal pastime and delight." I like to use the whole quote. Most people have probably heard the last line, music is the universal language of mankind. This might seem like an intuitive idea to a lot of people in cognitive science or in psychology, but when I was a grad student starting to study music cognition in infants, I came across a lot of scientific papers that opened with the line, music is universal, music is in every culture, something like that. And there's not usually a citation after it. And it turns out that the reason there's not usually a citation after it is this problem. Most of the work in the cognitive science of music happens in weird people or studying weird music, or both, with only a few nice exceptions, but only a few of them. That's one reason that we don't really know much about this universality question, but another reason is more sort of in the data science world, which is that there's this enormous world of data out there describing musical behavior and musical forms worldwide, but it's distributed across lots of resources. There aren't any big databases that you can go to ask, what is it that's the same about music in one culture or another? What is it that makes music sound one way or another around the world? So this is a problem that we're trying to solve in the Natural History of Song project. And today I'm going to talk about just a few highlights from two papers that we've published recently about this work. These are both really long papers, so I'm just going to give you kind of a highlight reel of findings that might be relevant to the group here. But we can, if you have questions about other stuff in the papers, just ask it. So I'm going to talk briefly about 4 different questions that we'll ask in this project. First, we're going to ask, just trivially, is music universal? Does it turn up everywhere? But then we're going to ask more interesting questions than that, like how is music universal? How is it patterned worldwide? What behaviors are out there that are universally associated with music around the world? And then we'll get into the sounds of the music themselves, the music itself, which is essentially are songs underlaid by particular features that make it sound one way or another based on the behavioral context in which it appears worldwide. Okay, so what is this Natural History of Song project? The data take 2 forms. There's a whole world out there of people making music, and for a long time, anthropologists have gone out into the world and observed those behaviors. They write down what they see, they publish it in books. These books and articles and things get published and aggregated by a database organization at Yale called Human Relations Area Files. Anyone ever use this organization, HRAP? Anybody? Okay, that's usually, 1 or 2 people, cool. This is a great resource for psychologists. It's an enormous database of primary ethnography describing behavior and essentially the products of minds worldwide. But anyway, this database has lots and lots of text, and we aggregate text from this database into a corpus we call the NHS ethnography. This is text describing musical behavior worldwide. Okay, so music is also an auditory phenomenon. It's not just the behavior that's associated with it, and thankfully people have been going out into the world and listening to this music, recording it, publishing it in anthologies, in CDs, LPs, old reel-to-reel tapes, and so on. These end up in libraries and archives, and there isn't an organization like the HRAF that organizes them. So we did that ourselves, and we built a second corpus that we call the NHS Discography. This is audio recordings of the music and so on. So I'm going to give you a few findings from each of these corpora today, starting with the ethnography. So to give you a bit more detail about how this works, like I said, we've got this big world, lots of anthropology being written. This ends up in the HRAF. And from the HRAF, we sample from 30 different world regions, where there are 60 different cultures that are generally thought to give a pretty representative sample of human behavior worldwide. From all of the text describing behavior in those cultures, we get every example of vocal music. So we do a keyword search and also a tag search. There's a bunch of behavioral tags in this corpus as well. And that gives us about 5,000 descriptions of musical behavior surrounding vocal music worldwide. They come from a lot of different documents, about 750,000 words of text. We then annotate all this with a bunch of different variables. I'll talk more about that in a minute. We also get metadata, document level metrics, so that we can link different descriptions to one another and deal with bias correction across those. And then we get the whole background text of the corpus so that we can do some other bias corrections, which I'll also talk about. Okay, so to ask this first question, trivially, does music appear everywhere? All we have to do is look at this raw text. Is there text from all of these cultures describing music? This is what the text looks like in the GUI for the HRAF. You can see a description of what the anthropologists observed. These are the locations of the 60 societies from which we gathered text. And I'm just going to scale the points by how many words of text we have from each society describing music. All of them have music, 60 of 60 societies. So this is a pretty straightforward demonstration that, yeah, this is universalist behavior in terms of worldwide. Cool. Okay, so I can just end the talk here. No, we'll keep going and talk a little bit more about the more interesting stuff in this paper, which is how is music universal? So how does it vary? What are the underlying structures of music worldwide? So to analyze this, we're going to use the manual annotations that we have for this corpus. This is from the 5,000 descriptions of text. We annotate a whole bunch of different features. So what's present, who's there, what time of day is it, what are they doing, and so on. So I'm just going to change the font here. This is some raw text, and I'll highlight a few things. So this is a description of a lullaby, and a few things that we would get from this. So one thing is that the annotators code function. So they might code that this is a song that's being used to put someone to sleep, that it's used for soothing. They might mention that it's during the day. We get time of day from this. We separate text that is translated lyrics from description. So in these lyrics, there's a really nasty mother-in-law. And it would be a bit weird if we were analyzing the nasty mother-in-law text along with the descriptive text, so we separate those out. We also get a bunch of binaries. Is there a child present? Is there a kin relation between the singer and the listener? And so on. So we have about 60 different variables. So what are we going to do with all this data? The first question is whether there's some kind of latent structure to these annotations. We want to see if there's some set of dimensions, some small number of dimensions that reliably characterize how music varies worldwide. And then what we can do is, if we can get that structure, we can ask, in each particular society, how do those dimensions differ from one another? Do we see societies that are quite similar to one another or quite different from one another? So how do we do this? We've got very high dimensional data here. There's a lot of missingness because ethnography is messy. And there's a lot of weird nesting where some books have a lot of descriptions of music and other books have not a lot of descriptions of music. To solve this problem, we're going to use Bayesian principal components analysis. Anyone ever used that in this room? Oh, okay, more hands, cool. Great. So rather than treating this as a fancy black box of algorithmic joy, we're going to do a little bit of validation on it. So one thing is that we know that there's some types of songs that turn up worldwide. We know that there are lullabies. We know that there are dance songs, for instance. And we're going to try and recover those clusters from the dimensional space that we compute from this analysis. So what do we find when we do this? First, we get 3 dimensions, the PCA works, that explain just under a third of the variability in musical behavior. We slap some labels on these because they seem to correspond with intuitive judgments of what musical behavior are. Things like how formal the song is, how exciting or not exciting the song is, and how religious or secular the song is. But these are just labels. This isn't really the finding. The clustering results is what sort of convinced us that this analysis really works. If you have a computer in front of you, you can go to that link up there and explore this interactively yourself. So this is the full 5,000 descriptions of song plotted in those 3 dimensions. And what we can do is just search for each of these text descriptions for some keywords that identify them as a dance song, a lullaby, a healing song, or love song. When we do that, we get 4 different clusters that are a little bit mushy here. And the question that we wanted to ask here is, are the clusters coherent? So we found the geometric centroid of each cluster and just asked for each song type, what proportion of all of the examples of that song are nearest to their own centroid rather than the centroids of the other clusters. So for the blue guys, which are dance songs, how many of the dance songs are closest to the dance centroid in this 3-dimensional space than rather than closest to lullaby or healing and so on? And the answer is most of them are quite close to their own centroid. So this PCA seems to be capturing some variability in known features of musical behavior worldwide. Okay, so there's some structure to musical behavior. Then we can ask, given that structure, how do societies compare to one another? So that's sort of a high-level test of the universality question. You could imagine a few different worlds that we could be living in. If we're studying 8 different societies here, you've measured some feature, let's say that formality dimension of the PCA. You could imagine a world where there's some societies that have only really formal music, other societies that have only really informal music. You could imagine another world where there's a lot of sort of strong universality, where everybody's right down the middle, and there might be a little bit of variability on either side, but right down the middle, societies are pretty similar to one another. Or something in between, where there is some society-to-society variability. Here's the mean of society 5 is probably more formal than the mean of society 8. But nevertheless, a mean formality, by that dotted line song, could appear in any of these societies. And that third world is the world that we're living in. So this is the formality result. This graph is really tall, so I'll zoom out a bit there. And we actually find the same result here for all 3 of the dimensions that we studied. So here's the arousal result. These are the 60 societies from that corpus. And here's the religiosity result. So in a sense, what I've just shown you is a data-y qualitative demonstration of universality. We can also quantify this by measuring how much within society variability there is in each of these societies and compare the ratio of within society variability to between society variability. And what we do when we what we find when we do that analysis is that there's much more within society variability than between society variability. So this is taking a page for behavioral genetics essentially gives us a high-level test of the question, how similar are societies to one another? The answer is quite similar. Then we can move on to this third question here. So in question number 2, we're asking a fairly sort of, let's say, superficial question about similarity. In question number 3, we want to look at very specific behavioral contexts. So there's all these hypotheses out there for what music might be used for worldwide. Things that we can answer with a yes or no. Does music turn up in the context of parenting? Does music turn up in the context of ritual worldwide? So we wanted to test those hypotheses. The problem is those hypotheses are hard to test until we have this corpus because ethnographers are biased. If an ethnographer is writing a book about religion, all of the examples of music that they have in their book are going to be religious music. If they're writing a book about parenting, they're all going to be parenting music. So we're going to use the fact that we have this background corpus as an adjustment for the biases of the ethnographers. How does the method work? Basically, we're going to compare the frequency of a particular behavior in NHS, that's in our corpus, to the frequency of that behavior in the background corpus. We're going to take the base rate of reporting for a particular behavior and say when ethnographers are writing about music, do they write about that behavior more often than you would expect or not? So this is just for all kinds of bias, including nefarious ones. Some ethnographers, it's not that they're writing about a book about religion, it's that they're sexists and they don't write about women. So we want to deal with that kind of bias. What are we going to test? We generated a list of 20 different hypotheses coming from lots of different places, including surveying academics. Some of you may be participants in our survey about this. And here's what those hypotheses are. They're pretty intuitive, places where you might expect to find music in different cultures around the world. I'll go through a few more in a minute. And let me give you one version of the analysis that we do here. This is an analysis using the raw text of that corpus, the actual descriptions from ethnographers. So we take a given hypothesis, in this case children's music, and we use a word that we think characterizes this hypothesis pretty well. So child, pretty reasonable. And we feed that word into the WordNet lexical database, which I think is based here. That gives us a whole bunch of other terms. since we don't know a priori how every ethnographer might use this word. We give this list to a couple of expert anthropologists who strike some of the weirder words and add words that they think are missing. That gives us a target list of keywords that we're going to be looking for in the background corpus and in text about music. Here are the seed words for the whole data set. And the question is, when we simulate a background corpus to get the base rate of how much this aggregate list of words is being used in text about any behavior, how often do those words turn up when the ethnographers are writing about music? And the answer is, for almost all of these hypotheses, they turn up much more frequently than you would expect. Such as an association across these 60 societies between music and each of these 19 to 20 hypotheses. Now, this is a fairly liberal test of the hypotheses. No person has read all of this text. So to replicate the result, we used a different set of tags. Rather than keywords, we used these things on the top right here. These are called OCM identifiers. These are human-generated annotations that we didn't do. They're generated by the Human Relations Area Files folks, by people who didn't know that we were going to use them to study music. And simply what we do here is exactly the same analysis, taking the base rate of usage of these annotations and comparing how often these turn up with music relative to the base rate of each author. So all we have to do is associate an identifier with each hypothesis. Some of the associations are better than others. So for dance, there is an identifier for dance. For love, the closest thing we got was arranging a marriage. So some are better than others, as you can tell. And we just repeat the analysis, and we replicate it most of the time. Here they are together, with WordNet on the left and OCM identifiers on the right. So what this tells us is that there are a small set of behaviors that turn up worldwide in association with music, and those behaviors were pretty well predicted by literature, by people in the field, and by sort of lay people's ideas about where music is used worldwide. Okay, so let's get to the fourth question. I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this because it's a bit more fun and it's a bit more sort of citizen science-y. This is an analysis using the second corpus, the NHS discography. I'll tell you a little bit more about how that worked. There's all of these archives, libraries, lots of places where you can get music worldwide. We use the same geographic stratification method that the HRAF uses to gather their data. And we find an example of dance songs, healing songs, love songs, and lullabies. These songs are classified based on the ethnographic text generated by the people collecting the recordings. So by the expert in each society, they say this is a lullaby, this is a dance song. This is where the songs come from. And in a first paper, we did a very simple experiment, which you guys can participate in right now. We play an excerpt of a song to the listener. We ask them how much is used for a particular purpose, used to soothe the baby, used for dancing, used to heal illness, to express love. And we do that a whole bunch of times. This is what the method looks like. We did this first on Turk. So let's give it a try. This is going to be too loud. But I'm going to play you a song and then I'll ask you a question about it. Okay, so think of the singer, and if you think that the singer is definitely using the song to soothe the baby, raise your hand very high, or definitely not very low, or somewhere in the middle. Go ahead, what do you think? Okay, keep your hand up where it is, and look around. You can see it's a fairly low variance measure. Okay, here's another one. Seeing many confused faces, that's good. This one is more high variability. Okay, what do you think? High or low? Look around the room. Okay, here's one more. Okay, so you get the idea. So we did that not just for use to soothe the baby, but for all four of these questions and a couple of control measures as well. The first paper that we did this with had a bunch of Turkers, 750 Turkers in 60 different countries. As you can see, they're not distributed evenly worldwide. Anybody who's done cross-cultural work on Turk has gotten exactly this pattern. There's lots of Americans, lots of Indians, and lots of everybody else. That's a problem, but we'll start with it for now. The Turkers listen to 36 excerpts apiece, so that works out to lots of listens per song, so I'll plot the average rating of each song on each of the dimensions that we measure. What do we find? So on the question used to soothe the baby, I'm going to plot here the average of each song. That's on the left y-axis. The right y-axis is just a normalization of it. And I'm going to group the songs by what they're actually used for. This is what the ethnographers in each culture said that they were used for, whether it was an infant present, whether it was used for dancing, or so on. When they're listening to a song that is intended to soothe the baby, they rate it quite highly as used to soothe the baby, higher than the other three song types, and higher than this global average, which is represented by the dotted line. Another kind of fun finding here is that dance songs and healing songs are really not for soothing babies. There's some variability here, but you can see how sort of strikingly different these distributions are. When we ask the other questions, we get exactly the opposite effect. Dance songs are rated really highly as used for dancing. Lullabies are really, really not used for dancing. And healing songs and love songs are somewhere in the middle. We even saw effects on healing songs here, which is not a genre that people in the Western world tend to use very much, and probably not a genre that people on the internet use very much either. Smaller effects here, but healing songs are picked out relative to the other three and relative to the global average. The only kind of song that we studied that didn't seem to have any effect like this are love songs. Love songs are more ambiguous, harder to pick out by people on the Turk. And another question that we wanted to ask is how consistent are listeners with one another? So we took our cohort of Turkers here, we split them into 3 groups based on their sampling. As you can see, this is not great. We'll get to that. And here we've got 250 people a cohort. And we just asked how consistent are they with one another on their ratings of each song. So putting each cohort on one dimension, it's a little bit hard to see the background of this cube. If they agree with each other perfectly, we should see a diagonal right down the middle of the cube here. And if they disagree with each other, we should see a cloud or some other thing. This is what we actually find. So the green points here are actually lullabies. This is how much each song is used to soothe the baby, as rated by each of the 3 cohorts. You can see not only do they agree with each other across the 3 cohorts, but within each cohort there's really strong distinction between lullabies and not lullabies. And we get the same result for the other song types. I don't actually have them here. Because I wanted to move on to the conceptual replication that we did, which is our Pushkin experiment, which Josh is going to talk about later, I think. So one of the issues that we had with that paper is that our Turkers are really, really poorly distributed worldwide. When that first paper came out last year, the New York Times ran a piece where they built a little tool where they played our songs to their readers, and they just asked them, what kind of song you can be listening to. In about a week, they had 200,000 people answer all 8 of the questions that they had. Presumably, they had many, many more people do at least one. They didn't give me all the analytics for it. But over the last 6 months, we've built something similar to this. I said 6 months. I really should be more like 18 months or something like that. It feels shorter than it was. Anyway, this is my lab's platform for citizen science online. We have a whole bunch of different games about different aspects of music perception and music cognition. And one of the first games we posted was called the World Music Quiz, which was basically a Pushkin version of the New York Times game. And simply we play songs to people and we ask them to tell us what it's used for. If they're playing on a desktop, they answer with a keyboard. If they're playing on mobile, they tap a response. We've done this, in the paper we put about 30,000 participants in there, which means many, many ratings of each song. And they come from many more countries, many more languages, and a much better distribution of them. So there's one big chunk of the 30,000 participants that's from the US, but then there's a much longer tail of countries where we've got about 1,000 participants from each country. And what do we find? So here I'm just going to plot the proportion of guesses for each of the song types. So when participants are listening to a dance song, they're much more likely to rate it as a dance song than the other 3 song types. Same deal for lullabies. A little bit more ambiguous, but still a result for healing songs. And in love songs, there's sort of a funky result where they rate love songs more often as healing songs than as love songs. But that's accounted for by the base rate of responses for healing songs in general. So everybody has a response bias towards healing songs, maybe because they're quite ambiguous to Western listeners, such that there's still a positive effect here of detecting love songs relative to the low base rate of reporting love songs. So one way of looking at that last result here is that our citizen scientists are better at identifying love songs than our Turkers. So anyway, I think this is good evidence for this 4th question here. There does seem to be some underlying structure of universals in musical forms, both one. I'm just about out of time, so I'm going to skip the last thing here and just say one other thing, just that I'm excited about this stuff because I think that in the science of music, in particular my little subfield, we don't have a ton of work in citizen science and in a lot of big data approaches outside of the music informatics world, which is not really a world that's that interested in how the mind works. So I'm really excited that people are into these new kinds of methods, and yeah, looking forward to talk about it more with all of you. So thanks to my collaborators, thanks to the funders, and thanks to you.
Tom's getting set up. Does anyone have a question for Sam?
I'm actually from one of the societies that we study.
Oh, cool.
So I had a question about the arousal metric and how it was coded. Because I saw it was actually this Island Scots, right? It was rated like not very rousing. And I wondered if how you account for like within societies that I might find it more rousing and people are the wrong like it sounds like a horrible urge. So
Right, for sure. So the arousal metric is gathered from the ethnographer's ratings of, so from the set of annotations of the ethnographers in text describing music from small scale societies, not actually the Highland Scots that you're from, but from like 150 years ago. So
it's not changed much.
well, yeah, I mean, so it may have changed, it may not have changed. We don't actually know, though, what people from the societies themselves think of the music of society. And that's really important because we haven't studied people from each society yet. So I think this is an example of, so a couple people so far have already mentioned that it's really nice to complement these sort of big data approaches with, field work and lab studies and that kind of thing. That's something that we're really interested in doing because of that problem, right? Who knows if the ethnographic text that we have in the society is good. So yeah, the short answer is I agree with that issue.
Great, thank you.